In this lecture, we will be examining the causes and the major events that led up to the American Revolution. First, let's start with a brief discussion of mercantilism, which was the principal economic philosophy that dominated the thinking of the British during the 17th and 18th centuries. Mercantilism is the belief that a nation's wealth is best measured by its supply of capital. They believe that global trade is finite and that a country needed to get a bigger slice of pie, in a metaphorical sense, to increase national wealth. Government policies should then encourage exports and inhibit imports. To increase gold reserves, a country must export more than it imports, and colonies should serve as export markets for the mother country under mercantilist philosophies. Colonies become sources for raw materials needed in the production of finished goods, and under mercantilist thinking, colonies should be prevented from trading except with the mother country. Colonies should be prevented from producing their own finished goods and instead buy those from the metropolitan country, or the mother country, as it's sometimes still called. Related to mercantilism is a concept known as Bullionism, and this theory is that the wealth of a nation is best measured by the amount of gold and silver bullion that it holds. Proponents believe gold and silver were so rare that the value of these precious metals would remain relatively unchanged. This is sometimes true in the short term, but in the long term, the price of gold and silver, as we know today, can vary widely. American colonists were forced to use British, French, and Spanish coins for trade. The American colonies consistently imported more British goods than they could export under mercantile policies, and there was a prolonged shortage of specie, which is another term for hard currencies such as gold and silver coins, like the gold guinea depicted in the image here. In some cases, American colonists had to barter in order to keep the economy moving, and in other cases they had to create paper currency to meet the specie shortage. Parliament tried to ban the printing of paper money, which was one of many colonial grievances. The Currency Restraining Act of 1764 in particular reduced the ability of American colonists to create their own currency. There were a variety of trade restrictions and discriminatory tariffs that worsened the colonial trade deficit. Even worse, there were no bank charters and no financial institutions to handle credit, which choked off trade and economic growth in the colonies. There was a significant trade deficit that emerged in the period from 1763 till the American Revolution. For the colonial monetary system, deficits had to be paid by specie or by debt. One major problem at that time, there were no silver and gold mines in the colonies, and there was an additional scarcity of bullion. In terms of financing enterprise in the American colonies, there was some short-term debt, and merchant credit was sometimes offered. But in general, this was a period of increasing indebtedness for merchants, for farmers, especially tobacco planters. And there was virtually no long-term investment in the American colonies, with the exception of personal savings. Despite its restrictive nature, mercantilism did provide some benefits to American colonists. Mercantilist price supports and subsidies helped American colonies compete against other European countries. American colonies essentially possessed a tobacco monopoly, and the market in Europe was quite lucrative for American tobacco in the 17th and 18th centuries. American colonists possessed the legal rights accrued to English citizens, and they had some levels of autonomy. The American colonies received the protection of the British military. That was especially helpful during the 7 Years' War, known in the United States as the French and Indian War. And for much of the 18th century, the American colonies experienced significant economic growth, and quite a few American colonists grew wealthy during this time. After the 7 Years' War, Britain turned to the American colonies to raise revenue to pay off war debt and to pay for British troops stationed in the American colonies. British Prime Minister George Grenville is closely associated with ending the policy we discussed in a previous lecture known as salutary neglect. And increasingly, the American colonies faced significant economic restrictions and new taxes after a long period of relative autonomy. Among the acts put together by Parliament to raise revenue after the 7 Years' War, the Sugar Act actually reduced the amount paid on a gallon of molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon. The British hoped that the lowering of the tax would mean that it would actually be collected. The previous law, the 1733 Molasses Act, many colonists simply ignored it, and there was a booming black market in illegal molasses and illegal sugar. With this Sugar Act, though, the British stepped up enforcement, so a tax that really hadn't been paid was now coming due. There was significant outcry by the American colonists, and eventually the tax was reduced again to 1 pence per gallon in 1767. With the Quartering Act of 1765, American colonies were expected to provide housing and provisions for British troops stationed in the colonies. We discussed earlier the Currency Act of 1764, which forbid the use of paper currencies for public and private debts, further worsening the money problem in the colonies. But by far the most unpopular of these new revenue-enhancing acts was the Stamp Act, which required that printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper produced in London, which contained an embossed revenue stamp, as depicted in the image. The act covered such items as newspapers, books, magazines, legal documents, and even playing cards. In response, the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 was formed. This was the first gathering of elected representatives from American colonies to develop a united protest against a British tax. The Stamp Act Congress declared that Parliament did not have the right to create the tax because it did not include representation from the American colonies. The Congress also developed non-importation agreements on a number of British goods. This was designed to hurt Britain by alienating British merchants. The Stamp Act was also instrumental in sparking civilian outrage that took the form of groups such as the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. Parliament took two simultaneous actions after this widespread protest. It first issued the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament did indeed have the right to issue taxes. At the same time, though, Parliament was forced to repeal this hated Stamp Act. Shortly thereafter, in 1767, a series of measures known as the Townshend Acts, named after British political leader Charles Townshend, replaced these earlier taxes. But these too were met with significant resistance. The unrest associated with the Townshend Acts led to the occupation of Boston by British troops in 1768, which indirectly resulted in the Boston Massacre of 1770. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a British private was on guard duty in front of the Customs House in Boston. A crowd of citizens assembled and began taunting the soldier. His requests for help brought 9 soldiers who were led by British Captain Thomas Preston. The crowd continued to berate the soldiers with insults and also threw snowballs at the soldiers. At some point during the commotion, an unknown person yelled "Fire!" and British soldiers began shooting. 3 people were initially killed, 8 more were wounded, 2 of whom died later, bringing the death toll to 5. After the tragedy, there were protests and calls for the soldiers to be tried and executed. At the ensuing trial, Preston and 6 soldiers were exonerated. 2 of the soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter, though they served relatively short sentences and were later released. The event served to further calls for independence, as popular perception emerged that this was an event that was an example of what the British government thought of American colonists. The Tea Act of 1773 was a measure that was met with a great deal of hostility in the American colonies. The backdrop to the 1773 Tea Act was the financial struggles of the British East India Company, the EIC for short. The company struggled with decreased demand for its tea due to high tea taxes in England, and Parliament attempted to help the EIC move its oversupply in warehouses by giving the company favorable taxes on tea in the American colonies. The act essentially gave the East India Company a complete monopoly on the American tea business. The EIC was then able to sell tea more cheaply than smuggled Dutch tea sold by American merchants, even after factoring in the added tax. American tea merchants were essentially cut out of the picture, and there were quite a few of them in Boston, being a major port town. This law angered many colonists who saw this as a ruse to make the tea tax less obvious. As a result, we have an event known as the Boston Tea Party. A group of white Bostonians wearing Indian costumes climbed aboard 3 tea ships on December 6, 1773. The group smashed hundreds of tea chests and dumped the imported tea into Boston Harbor. Tea protests also occurred in Annapolis and Charleston related to the Tea Act. In today's money, the destroyed tea represented over $1 million in lost value to the East India Company. In reaction to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament enacted a number of laws in response. These were known in England as the Coercive Acts, but became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the East India Company had been reimbursed for the destroyed tea and until order was restored. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially eliminated any home rule in that state, as almost all positions in the colonial government were now appointed by the governor or by the king. The Quartering Act authorized the colonial governors to use unoccupied buildings to house British troops stationed in the colonies. And the Administration of Justice Act permitted colonial governors, who again were appointed by the king, to relocate the trials of accused royal officials to another colony or even to Great Britain if the governor thought the accused official could not get a fair trial. The American public, of course, grew emboldened by the Boston Tea Party, and this has become an iconic event in our history. Related to the Intolerable Acts was something known as the Quebec Act. Came out at the same time. It was not part of the Intolerable Acts, but colonists thought this was just as intolerable as the other acts, and that the Quebec Act was intended to punish the colonists. The law expanded the territory of Quebec and provided greater freedom to its French-speaking inhabitants. This region had come under British rule as a result of the 7 Years' War. However, the American colonists saw this model of government as a threat to their existing freedoms, and many Protestants also feared this was some sort of hidden attempt to promote Roman Catholicism. In response to the Intolerable Acts, colonists initiated the First Continental Congress in 1774. The group met in Philadelphia to develop methods of addressing these colonial grievances. 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates, and the total number of representatives was 55. All were men. Georgia was the only colony that did not send a representative, as it was seeking British help at that time in a conflict with Native American groups. While the Congress politely petitioned King George III for redress on colonial grievances, the British response to the Congress was dismissive and somewhat provocative. British leaders redeployed troops in the colonies, and in response to the new troop movements, the colonial governments began to prepare to arm the colonial militias. Both sides at this point appeared to be preparing for a decisive military battle, and that indeed was what would follow.